Hey everyone, it's Miss Queen Crypto, and I am back again for another episode of Friday Block Talk. Home sweet home, we've got the usual setup going on. We've got some lovely light streaming in, no dilated eyes, so I would say this is a pretty great start to a video. But today I wanted to talk about a topic that I've talked about extensively, at least in the past couple of weeks, but that's because it's kind of a big deal, and that's inflation. So instead of talking about kind of like the consequences of inflation, I wanted to go more into the economic principles of inflation and what would drive a government to inflate the money supply given the consequences of that. We see countries falling and absolute devastation, like wiping out people and destroying their lives because of inflation. So why would a country do this? So with that in mind, let's get into it. So I'm going to take you back to my high school economics course, and I'm going to talk to you about the first time I actually learned about inflation in an educational setting. And so my teacher taught us that inflation is something that the government wants because they want it to be an incentive to spend your money. So if the money supply is inflating at a relatively low rate, your money does have more value today than it will have 5 years down the line. So if you want that thing, go buy it, and that's good for the economy because it means people are spending their money, and that means that it's actually circulating and people aren't just holding it. Converse to a deflationary asset where that would be bad for the economy because people would be thinking about their money being more valuable the longer they hold on to it, and therefore people would be less likely to spend and the economy would be less healthy and there would be less of like an actual circular cycle of money. So you want a little bit of inflation. That's what I was taught, at least. And I mean, it's one of those things that in high school you don't really think too much about it. You're just like, yeah, okay, take it at surface value. I guess that makes sense, whatever. But it's not until you hear like real world stories, until you actually start to question it and question what you're taught. At least that's the case for me. I remember hearing about Venezuela and I was trying to think like, how could this even happen? Like, what could drive a government to want this for its people, or even like inadvertently, like how can it get that bad? But I don't have the answer for that. However, I can explain to you why a government would do it. Obviously, the goal isn't to destabilize the economy. That never is. However, governments have a fun little tendency of spending more money than they actually have. And so, my gosh, we're getting into a US government lesson too, holy cow. But governments, obviously their main revenue is taxes, taxation in the form of property tax, income tax, social security tax. It depends on what we're talking about, but it's one of those things where the government has an income basically, and they have to budget around that. Now, we get fun little projects that we don't have money for, and so instead of waiting or reallocating money to where it's needed, which Congress is supposed to do at the beginning of every year, they are able to simply print more money. And now that's where we get the whole money printer machine go brrr, but that's exactly what happens. Now, I'm not super close-knit with the Federal Reserve. I understand the reason that they print money is because dollar bills get destroyed all the time, coins get lost, you want to have a good amount of money in circulation. I do think we get into tricky territory now, though, because so many of our assets are online at this point in time. Like, how are they actually keeping track of that? But it's another story for another day. Anyways, but they're supposed to be printing to kind of keep those numbers like in flux, and so it's not like crazy changing, and the money supply shouldn't be too different on a given day. However, obviously that can be put into bad use. That can have dire consequences, and that's what we see. It's what we see with hyperinflation, where a country's dollar is worth virtually nothing, and people use it as toilet paper, and entire like family savings have been wiped out in like the blink of an eye. That's hyperinflation. And in my econ class, they did say, now that's bad, but why do you think that one is so different from the other? Obviously, to have hyperinflation, you must start with inflation. But in order to pay for much larger projects that they did not allocate for in the budget, they can print more money in the hopes that everything's going to be fine, guys. It's not a big deal. It's only like a couple $1 trillion. It's like not a big deal. But that's what could lead the government to inflating the money supply. Obviously, we have had dire unforeseen circumstances like COVID, and that led to a mass printing of money in order to supply the COVID relief checks. But even without that, we still have this problem, and that's still something that we probably need to work on, especially with the new 9.1% inflation marker. Once we hit 8%, everyone was shocked because that was ridiculously high, higher than what people had been saying, and we know it actually is higher than that even, or it likely is higher than that, and they're just reporting on what they know. But to have it come back 1% higher is really scary to hear, and not just a driver for why Bitcoin is the answer, but it's something that our government should take action on. Like, there should be something that the government can't print, like X amount of money, or like the government can't print money in order to pay for its own projects. Like, I feel like that should be a federal law, but you know, whatever, we don't like those here. But anyways, it's a tough situation because inflation is something that we can see the consequences of like in real time. And it's hard because it's a pretty gradual process. Like, you don't notice it until it's too late. I don't know if any of you have watched Film Theory, but they also have Food Theory now. And they talked about how inflation is like kind of tricky because a product like a Pringles can either make the price of the can more expensive, or they can decrease the size of it just marginally, so you don't notice necessarily that there's a difference in the size or of the amount of chips you're getting, but there still is, and that's how they're cutting costs for inflation. And it makes it tricky to be a consumer because you want to be smart, but there are companies and they're just trying to make it out of it too, but a lot of the times it's exploitative to the consumer, and that's never a good thing, especially for people who aren't getting like increased wages in order to combat it. Like, rent's going up, and that's a product of inflation. Gas is going up. Those are circumstances all on its own, but inflation of course does play a part in it, and people will say that partially it's inflation. But the grocery store is getting more and more expensive, and it's tricky, it's tough. And wages, people don't want to increase wages because they don't want to make it worse. So inflation is something that even in the United States we are seeing the consequences of pretty direly. And it's hard when you talk about it to not try and make it a case point for Bitcoin, to not use it as a way to be like, but guess what, there's this crazy good out. Because obviously Bitcoin is a store of wealth. I have talked about that probably the most I've talked about anything on this channel. But it's hard because for me at least, Bitcoin, once I put money in Bitcoin, I'm not planning on spending it anytime in the near future. The money that I have in Bitcoin, that I have stored in a wallet, is not going to see the light of day. I'm not spending that, at least for now. Like, that's something that I've decided I'm putting this money away. This is an investment for my future. That's exactly how I see it. But not everyone can do that. Not everyone can use Bitcoin as a hedge for inflation. It's still a very volatile asset. And so I think that we need to, I've said this before, but I think that we need to be sensitive to individual circumstances, and we need to be aware that not everyone's goal in Bitcoin is the same, and not everyone can use it the same. Because if someone is deciding to put their money, like their paycheck, into Bitcoin, and one day it's at like 25,000 and they're like, all right, good, deflationary asset, and it dips down to 23,000, they might not have enough money to pay for rent, or they might not have enough money to pay for gas or groceries. And that's something that I don't want for anyone in this community, but I don't want for anyone, period, honestly. So I think it's good to have open and honest conversations about inflation and the dangers of it, and also what we can do, hopefully. But the sad thing is, a lot of it is out of our control as citizens, as consumers. Like, we can't really do much ourselves except just exist. But hopefully, with all of the outrage over this 9.1%, hopefully things will start to change. But I'm going to leave it there. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave a like down below and subscribe to the Embily channel. And if you'd like to see more content from me complaining about inflation and raving about Bitcoin, you should follow me on Twitter at Miss Queen Crypto. But that's it for me today. I enjoyed talking to you guys, and I'll see you next week. Bye!